The rhythmic drip of muddy water from the ceiling was the only sound in the house, until the rusted tin lid gave way with a piercing, metallic shriek. Inside the hidden box, Linda didn't find the emergency cash for her son's future. She found a stack of letters wrapped in a faded ribbon, smelling of a perfume she didn't own. As she unfolded the first page, her salt-cracked fingers trembled, the ink blurring into a map of a life she never knew her husband was leading. In the next room, the blue flicker of the television illuminated the back of Mark's head. Motionless, silent, and suddenly terrifying. Linda looked from the empty bank statements in her lap to the man she had worked double shifts to support for 20 years, realizing the person sitting 3 feet away was a complete stranger. Outside, the fog of Gray Harbor swallowed the street. But for the first time in her life, Linda could see everything with a clarity that threatened to burn her world to the ground. The mechanical screech of metal against tin finally ceased as Linda Carver cut the power to the main conveyor. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that pulled at her eardrums, leaving a persistent, high-pitched ringing in their place. Her fingers, swollen and numbed by hours of immersion in icy brine and the abrasive touch of fish scales, fumbled with the knots of her heavy rubberized apron. Each movement required a conscious effort of will, her joints protesting against the damp chill of the plant. She stepped out through the towering iron gates of the Gray Harbor cannery, where the world disappeared into a thick, suffocating soup of gray fog. The mist clung to her skin like a wet shroud, mingling with the salt spray and the omnipresent stench of rotting fish that had long ago migrated from her clothes into her very pores. Linda trudged toward the gravel parking lot, a sharp pain radiating from her right hip with every step. Her heavy work boots made a rhythmic, wet sound as they hit the cracked asphalt, splashing through puddles of oily water. Above her, the streetlights flickered with a dying yellow pulse, failing to penetrate the gloom. The air in Gray Harbor felt heavy, a physical weight of moisture and coal soot that forced her shoulders to hunch, pulling her deeper into the exhaustion that defined her existence. The old Ford pickup groaned, its engine coughing a cloud of blue smoke before it finally died. The front bumper coming to rest against a wall of overgrown weeds by the porch. Linda climbed out of the cab, the rusted hinges of the door letting out a piercing scream that echoed through the quiet street. In the dying light, the house looked like a skeletal remains of a dream. The wooden siding had turned a bruised charcoal color, and the paint flaked away under her touch like layers of dead skin. The moment she crossed the threshold, the acrid, heavy scent of coal soot from the aging furnace hit her, thick enough to taste. She tossed her ring of keys onto the Formica countertop, the sharp, metallic clatter swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence of the hallway. The walls, draped in wallpaper that had yellowed to the color of a bruised apple, seemed to lean inward, constricting the space around her. Linda rubbed her hands against the rough fabric of her work jacket, trying to coax some warmth into her fingers. But the damp cold of the harbor had already permeated every corner of the structure, settling into the floorboards and the marrow of her bones. Mark sat anchored in the sagging recliner, his frame illuminated only by the flickering, sickly blue glow of the television screen. Linda came to a halt in the doorway, her gaze fixing on the motionless back of his head and the cluster of empty beer cans huddled like aluminum corpses around his feet. She moved forward, her boots scuffing loudly against the cracked linoleum to announce her presence. But Mark remained a statue, his eyes locked on the moving shadows of the screen. She asked him how the day had gone, her voice sounding thin and hollow in the drafty room. But the only response was the rhythmic hiss of static from the speakers. Her fingers gripped the back of a kitchen chair, the wood groaning under the pressure, as she watched the slight, involuntary twitch of Mark's jaw. He was a man drowning in his own apathy, intentionally ignoring her, retreating into a silence so dense it felt like a physical barrier between them. On the kitchen table, Toby had spread out a collection of glossy brochures, their bright university logos looking like jewels against the scarred wood. Linda moved closer, and Toby immediately began pointing with feverish intensity at photographs of glass-walled laboratories and lecture halls filled with light. She saw the frantic sparkle in his eyes as he spoke about scholarship requirements and the possibility of a life in a city where the air didn't smell of salt and decay. Linda swallowed hard, a lump of dry grief forming in her throat as she caught sight of her own hands, nails cracked and skin stained by the cannery, resting near Toby's clean, youthful fingers. Every word of hope he uttered felt like another stone added to the pack she carried on her back. She forced a tight, artificial smile, praying he wouldn't see the tremor in her hands while he described a future she felt increasingly incapable of providing. A sudden, heavy thud of rain hit the tin gutter outside, and seconds later, the sky over Gray Harbor collapsed into a violent downpour. Linda heard a sickening splash from the corner of the living room, where a stream of murky water began to pour from the ceiling onto the frayed carpet. A gray stain spread rapidly across the plaster, looking like a festering wound that refused to heal. The water struck the floor with a rhythmic, taunting sound. Thud, thud, thud. She scrambled to slide an old plastic bucket under the leak, the noise shifting to a hollow, metallic drum beat. The rain lashed against the window panes with the force of gravel, and Linda watched the wallpaper begin to blister and peel away under the sudden onslaught of moisture. The air in the room filled with the suffocating smell of damp plaster and ancient dust as she moved frantically, trying to shove the sofa away from the encroaching water. Linda pointed toward the expanding rot on the ceiling and told Mark to fetch the ladder from the shed. He didn't move. He simply shifted his weight deeper into the recliner, his eyes never wavering from the television as he gave a dismissive, microscopic shrug of his shoulders. A cold, sharp fury ignited in Linda's chest, and she turned on her heel, marching toward the back of the house. She threw open the door to the garage, where the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and oxidizing iron. Amidst a graveyard of broken lumber and rusted bicycle chains, she began to tear through the clutter, searching for the heavy metal toolbox. She tripped over a discarded gas can, the resulting crash echoing through the cramped space like a gunshot. Her shoulder ached from the physical strain of moving the heavy boxes, but she ignored the pain and the cold air biting through her thin sweater. Driven by a desperate need to fix something, anything, in their collapsing world. She shoved aside a heavy stack of old newspapers on the far shelf of the workbench, the paper damp and crumbling under her touch. Behind them, in the deepest shadows, her fingers brushed against a cold, hard surface. Linda pulled a tin cracker box into the dim light, its surface obscured by a thick velvet of gray dust. The painted design of red roses on the lid had been eroded by time and moisture until they looked like faded bloodstains. As she shook it, the unexpected weight inside shifted with a dull thud. Her heart began to race, the pulse thrumming in her temples as she set the box down on the scarred wood of the bench. She used her sleeve to wipe away the grime, the dust motes dancing in the weak light of the single overhead bulb. She hesitated for a second before prying at the tightly sealed lid with her fingernails. The lid gave way with a sharp, metallic screech that made her flinch. Inside, she found no receipts for the electric company or tax documents. Instead, the box was filled with neat bundles of envelopes, bound together by a length of faded ribbon. Linda pulled out the top sheet, and an immediate, cloying scent of cheap perfume filled her nostrils. Her eyes darted across the lines of text, written in a sprawling, feminine hand that spoke of a desperate tenderness and promises meant only for Mark. She rifled through the letters, each word burning her skin like a drop of acid. The dates spanned years, years during which she had worked double shifts at the cannery to keep the lights on. Her hands began to shake with a fine, uncontrollable tremor, and the ink seemed to bleed into the paper, the letters turning into illegible black smears before her eyes. Linda dug deeper into the tin, her fingers hitting a stack of folded bank statements at the bottom. She flipped through the pages, her breath hitching as she saw the regular withdrawals marked in red ink. These were the sums that were supposed to be Toby's tuition, the foundation of his escape from Gray Harbor. But now the balance columns were a series of devastating zeros. For 3 years, Mark had been systematically bleeding their accounts dry, funneling the money toward the addresses mentioned in those perfumed letters. A hollow, icy void opened in her chest. Every cent she had earned through sleepless nights and salt-burned hands had vanished into the pockets of a stranger. She clutched the papers to her chest, the sound of the crinkling parchment unnervingly loud in the tomb-like silence of the garage. She walked back into the living room, the stack of documents gripped so tightly in her hand that the edges bit into her palm. Mark was still in the chair, his profile looking as though it had been carved from cold, gray stone. Looking at the back of his head, Linda no longer saw a husband. She saw a predator who had spent years feasting on her labor and her loyalty. The flickering light from the television played across his face, revealing a hardness in the set of his mouth that she had never truly noticed before. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt poisoned. Mark slowly turned his head, his gaze meeting hers with a flat, empty indifference. In that moment, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man who shared her bed was a dangerous stranger, a liar hidden behind a mask of exhaustion. Linda pushed open the door to Toby's bedroom, the hinges moving with a soft groan. He was asleep, his head resting on an open biology textbook, the golden light from his desk lamp illuminating his features. She took a step toward the bed, her hand instinctively reaching out to brush the hair from his forehead. But she froze mid-motion. She saw the faint, untroubled smile on his face as he dreamed. And she knew that the truth about Mark would incinerate Toby's world in an instant. She clenched her jaw until her teeth throbbed with the pressure. Stepping back into the shadows of the hallway, she made a silent, freezing vow to remain quiet. She would not let the truth destroy him, not until she found a way to reclaim the future Mark had stolen and find a path out of the trap they were in. She stepped out onto the porch, turning her face upward to meet the cold, lashing rain. The fog of Gray Harbor swirled around her, erasing the outlines of the neighboring houses and the battered pickup truck in the driveway. The world felt as though it were dissolving into gray water and salt. Linda stood there, the stolen bank statements hidden against her heart, and allowed the chill to settle into her. The storm was no longer just outside. It was a part of her now. The following morning, Linda stood in the center of the cannery floor, where the piercing howl of circular saws drowned out the very possibility of thought. The shift supervisor, a man whose nerves seemed frayed to the point of snapping, clutched a clipboard to his chest as he moved toward the cork bulletin board. With short, jerky motions, he began pinning sheets of paper to the wood, the metallic clicks of the tacks sounding like small bone breaks. Linda watched the white pages flutter in the draft from the bay doors, looking like the wings of trapped birds. A crowd of workers in grease-stained coveralls began to press in around her, the air thickening with the scent of machine oil and the sour tang of communal fear. The supervisor hurried away without looking up, his fingers trembling as he retreated from the men and women whose lives had just been reduced to ink on a page. Linda shouldered her way through the wall of damp, heavy coats until her eyes locked onto the familiar sequence of letters in the middle of the second sheet. Her name was there, printed in a bold typeface that seemed to vibrate against the white background. At that moment, the roar of the machinery shifted into a dull, white noise, and the floor, slick with a coating of cutting emulsion, seemed to lose its solidity. She gasped for air, but the atmosphere was too thick with metallic dust to provide any relief. Her entire world narrowed down to that single line of text. Behind her, a man let out a guttural curse and slammed a fist into a steel support beam, the vibration rattling through the floorboards and into the soles of her boots. Later that evening, Linda set a plate of overcooked eggs on the kitchen table, moving with a deliberate slowness to keep the ceramic from clattering against the wood. Mark sat across from her, the sound of his fork scraping against the plate sending a shiver through her teeth. She forced her jaw to relax and asked him about the weather forecast, her voice a fragile imitation of normalcy. When Toby entered the room, she immediately fixed her gaze on her coffee cup, terrified that he would see the frantic, jagged light in her eyes. Under the table, her fingers dug into her own knees, the fabric of her jeans bunching under the pressure. Mark grunted a response, entirely unaware that she was hovering on the edge of a scream. The silence was shattered when Mark suddenly hurled his fork across the room. It hit the floor with a clatter that made Linda jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched as the veins in his neck bulged, his face flushing a dark, unhealthy crimson. He leveled a finger at her, his voice rising as he accused her of becoming a ice statue. A woman who did nothing but walk around with her mouth clamped shut in judgment. Linda watched the spray of his saliva settle on the floral patterns of the plastic tablecloth. But she couldn't find the words to fight back. Each insult he threw, calling her a miserable shrew, felt like a physical blow to her stomach. She kept her eyes down, maintaining the mask of a dutiful, tired wife for the sake of Toby, who stood frozen and pale in the kitchen doorway. Linda retreated to the bathroom, sliding the flimsy bolt into place and turning the faucet on full blast to drown out the sound of her own ragged breathing. She sat on the edge of the cold enamel tub, her eyes squeezed shut as she visualized the numbers on their bank statements. The unpaid electric bills and the empty savings columns played behind her eyelids like a horror film. She pulled her wallet from her pocket and counted the few crumpled bills inside. The amount was a joke, a pittance against the mountain of debt Mark had built. She realized then that within a month, the very walls of the house would no longer belong to them. The cold tile under her palms felt like a preview of the nights they would soon spend on the streets of Gray Harbor. A few days later, she pulled a stack of mail from the box and felt her heart drop at the sight of an envelope bearing a bright red urgent stamp. She tore it open, the paper shredding under her clumsy, shaking fingers. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, which detailed a series of delinquent loan payments she had never known existed. Mark hadn't just spent their savings. He had used the house as collateral. She stared at the foreclosure schedule, the dates looming like headstones. The nausea rose in her throat, and the printed words began to swim and double. She pressed the notification against her chest, the sharp corner of the paper biting into her skin through her blouse, marking her with the reality of their ruin. She walked down the main thoroughfare of Gray Harbor, where the wind whipped discarded newspapers into the air between rows of shuttered storefronts. The sound of a hammer hitting wood drew her attention to the grocery store on the corner. Two men in grime-streaked jackets were boarding up the windows with thick sheets of plywood. Linda saw the bitterness etched into their faces and heard one of them spit on the sidewalk, a curse directed at the city council and the factory owners. The town felt like a dying animal, its streets and alleys bleeding out. She wrapped her arms around herself, tucking her hands into her sleeves, while the rhythmic bang, bang, bang of the hammers echoed in her skull like a funeral march for everything she had ever worked for. In the cramped office of the school counselor, the air was stale, smelling of old coffee and dust. The man behind the desk adjusted his glasses and informed Linda that Toby's grant application required a certified bank statement showing a minimum of $5,000 in a dedicated account. Linda felt the moisture vanish from her throat, her hands gripping the handles of her purse until her knuckles turned white. She stared at a dying spider plant on the windowsill, while the man droned on about deadlines and federal regulations. Every word was a death sentence for Toby's dreams. She nodded mechanically, unable to speak, knowing that their accounts were a wasteland of zeros because of Mark's secret life. That night, Linda laid the college paperwork on the table and held out a pen to Mark. But his hand shot out and gripped her wrist with shocking force. She saw a flash of pure, unadulterated rage in his eyes as he snatched the documents from the table. Before she could protest, he began tearing the thick paper into tiny, jagged pieces, showering the floor with the white scraps like a fall of dirty snow. He screamed that Toby didn't belong in a university, that the boy needed to be at the scrapyard hauling metal the next morning. Linda stared at the remains of her son's future on the floor, while Mark stood over her, his chest heaving with the effort of his outburst. She waited until she heard the shower running, then slipped into the hallway to where Mark's jacket hung on a peg. The garment smelled of stale beer and cheap tobacco. She reached into the deep inner pocket, and her fingers found a stiff piece of cardstock. It was a business card for Vector Recovery Services, and on the back, someone had scrawled a date, the end of the following week. It was a notice for a final asset seizure. A cold sweat broke across her skin. Hearing the water stop in the bathroom, she shoved the card into her own pocket, the small piece of paper feeling like a hot coal against her thigh. Standing by the living room window, Linda watched a black sedan roll slowly to a stop at their sagging front gate. Two men in identical dark windbreakers stepped out, their faces devoid of any discernible emotion. She watched through the cracked blinds as one of them produced a camera and began taking methodical photographs of the house, focusing on the cracks in the foundation and the peeling paint. The second man made notes on a tablet. Pointing toward the rusted pickup in the driveway, Linda backed away into the shadows of the room, her heart thumping against her ribs like a panicked bird, terrified that they would see her, terrified of the inevitable invasion they represented. She stood in the darkness of the hallway, clutching a bank book that felt as dry and dead as a fallen leaf. From the kitchen, she could hear Mark's voice, loud and full of a sickening, false enthusiasm, as he told Toby about the new clothes they would buy for his first semester. Linda listened to the monstrous lie, watching through the crack in the door as Toby gave his father a trusting, hopeful smile. She felt something inside her snap, the last thread of her endurance turning into a sharp, jagged edge of ice. She looked at the back of Mark's head as he continued to weave his web of deception, and she squeezed the useless bank book until her fingers went white, the decision finally solidifying in her mind. The next morning, Linda pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank, the blast of sterile, refrigerated air hitting her like a slap. Behind the counter, a young teller with a perfectly knotted tie spent an agonizing several minutes tapping at his keyboard, his eyes carefully avoiding hers. She watched the red lines of transactions scroll across his monitor. The young man eventually sighed, took off his glasses to polish them, and shook his head with a look of rehearsed pity. Linda stared at the screen, where the time of Mark's last withdrawal was time-stamped only 2 hours prior. The air in the bank lobby felt thin and devoid of oxygen, and the rhythmic clatter of a nearby printer sounded like bone grinding against stone. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching a thin strip of thermal paper so tightly that the edges cut into her palm. The number 0.00 seemed to grow larger as she stared at it, becoming a black hole that threatened to swallow her whole. She thought of the letters in the rose-covered tin, the way that woman had begged Mark for a little help with her own debts. Every endearment in those letters was now a physical weight, a hand around Linda's throat. While Toby had been drawing floor plans of college dorms, Mark had been feeding their lives into a stranger's furnace. Linda felt a surge of hot, molten lead spread beneath her skin, her jaw tightening until it clicked. When she reached the house, a bright yellow notice was pinned to the front door, the state seal looking like a fresh bruise on the weathered wood. The adhesive tape on the corners was still shiny and clean. Linda stared at the words, "Forcible entry" and "seizure of property," and a sudden numbness took hold of her fingertips. The smell of rotting wood from the porch mingled with the scent of fresh ink. She ripped the paper down, the sound of the heavy gloss tearing sounding like a gunshot in the unnatural silence of the empty street. She threw open the living room door. Mark was sprawled in his chair, a cold beer pressed to his lips. Without a word, Linda upended the rose-patterned tin, and a landslide of letters and bank statements cascaded over his lap. Mark flinched as the sharp corners of the envelopes caught his skin, and beer splashed onto the yellowed pages. Linda jabbed a finger at the red marks on the statements, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow bursts. She saw his pupils dilate as they caught the light from the television. But he didn't apologize. He simply wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared up at her with a look of cold defiance. Mark shoved the beer can aside, the foam soaking into the carpet as he hauled himself to his feet. Linda watched his face contort, the veins in his forehead bulging like worms under his skin. Instead of a confession, he unleashed a torrent of vitriol, screaming about the stench of fish that followed her home and the suffocating misery of her constant penny pinching. He paced the room, calling the house a tomb and Linda a prison warden who had sucked the life out of him. Linda took a step back, stunned by the sheer volume of his hatred, which felt more substantial than the walls of the house they stood in. Toby appeared in the doorway, his shoulder hitting the frame with a dull thud that made Linda jump. She saw him looking down at the scattered letters with their faded roses and then at the twisted mask of his father's face. Toby's gaze darted between the documents and Mark, and Linda watched the blood drain from her son's face until he looked like a ghost. Mark didn't stop. His voice broke into a hoarse bark as he kicked a bank statement toward Toby's feet. Linda saw Toby's fingers tighten on the strap of his backpack until his knuckles looked like white stones. Linda scooped up a torn statement and thrust it toward Toby, her voice cracking as she told him the truth about the empty account and the stolen tuition. Mark let out a short, dry laugh that cut through the room like broken glass. He told Toby that university was a fairy tale for the weak, and that the money had been spent on real life. Linda watched the last light of hope vanish from Toby's eyes, replaced by a terrifying Arctic stillness. Mark continued to mock him, calling Toby's dreams a waste of family resources, while Linda felt a dark, impenetrable hatred coalesce in her gut. Mark made a sudden, lunging move toward her, his heavy palm striking Linda's shoulder and sending her reeling backward. Her boots slipped on the glossy paper of the letters, and she fell hard, her shoulder blade slamming into the sharp edge of a heavy oak end table. A trophy Toby had won in high school fell over with a metallic ring rolling across the floor. For a second, her vision went dark with a flash of white-hot pain, and the smell of dust from the carpet filled her nose. She propped herself up on one elbow, her arm throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat, while Mark loomed over her with his fists clenched. Toby moved then, a blur of motion that put him directly between Linda and Mark. Linda watched from the floor as her son's shoulders squared, his frame blocking out the light as he stood his full height. He looked Mark directly in the eyes, and there was such a concentrated, lethal coldness in his gaze that Mark actually stumbled back. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but under Toby's unblinking stare, he slowly retreated until his legs hit the edge of the sofa. Linda could hear Toby's heavy, rhythmic breathing, sounding like the warning growl of a cornered predator. Mark curled his lip into a pathetic sneer and spat his final words at Linda, telling her she had always just been a useful machine, a wallet he had finally emptied. She watched him wipe the sweat from his brow before he turned and headed for the bedroom. His heavy footsteps made the floorboards groan, followed by the thunderous slam of the door that shook the thin walls of the house. Linda heard the lock click into place, a sound that finally severed him from the wreckage of the living room. She felt his words soak into her like poison, leaving nothing but a vast, scorched emptiness behind. She remained on the floor, surrounded by the paper remains of their future. She ran her fingers through the carpet, feeling the jagged edges of the letters and the sticky patches where the beer had spilled. The walls of the house looked like gray headstones in the dim light, and the silence in the room pressed against her ears with a physical force. She looked up at the crack in the ceiling where the water was still dripping, realizing that this place was no longer a home. To her, every object in the room was now tainted by Mark's betrayal, turning the house into a pyre where not even a spark of warmth remained. Linda looked up and saw Toby standing by the window. He was methodically pulling the zipper of his backpack closed. He picked up his heavy biology textbook and dropped it into the bag with a dull thud, his eyes never once meeting hers. She caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. His face was a mask of stone, devoid of any youthful softness. He tightened the straps of the bag, and she saw in his eyes the same dead, arctic void that now filled her own chest. She realized that in that moment, Toby had crossed the threshold of his childhood and left everything they once believed in behind him. The next morning, Linda sat on a hard wooden stool, her eyes fixed on the kitchen clock. The ticking sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. The pale light of dawn struggled through the grime on the window, illuminating the dust motes frozen in the cold air. When the bedroom door finally clicked open and Mark shuffled out, his heels dragging on the linoleum, Linda stood up. Her fingers were locked around the cold, rough iron handle of the heavy fireplace poker. She didn't say a word. She simply made a short, sharp motion with her chin toward the front door, which she had already thrown wide open. The smell of wet earth and pre-dawn chill flooded the kitchen, and Linda shifted her grip on the iron, feeling its lethal weight. Mark tried to grab her arm, his voice a high, whining plea, but she threw him off with a violent jerk of her shoulder. She grabbed 2 sports bags she had packed with his things and heaved them out onto the muddy asphalt of the driveway. The rain immediately soaked into the fabric, turning his clothes into heavy, shapeless lumps. Linda watched his boots sink into the slush as he scrambled between the porch and his belongings, his face a mask of impotent rage. She stood on the top step, as rigid and unyielding as a statue, the water dripping from her chin while Mark shouted curses into the downpour. She slammed the door, and the sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place cut off his voice. She didn't look back at the empty rooms. Instead, she walked straight to the old pickup truck, the engine turning over with a long, agonizing cough. She drove through the gray slag toward the edge of town, where the skeletons of the abandoned docks loomed over the water. The developer's office was tucked in the shadow of the cannery, smelling of rust and old grease. Linda pushed open the heavy door, entering a space of harsh, fluorescent light. She shook the water from her jacket onto the carpet and laid a folder of documents on the desk, while the cranes outside screeched, tearing into the old factory walls. Linda picked up a cheap plastic pen, the sound of it scratching against the paper feeling louder than the machinery outside. The ink formed jagged lines on the legal document, formalizing the sale of her home for a fraction of what it was once worth. She saw the developer's eyes crinkle with satisfaction as he pulled the contract toward him. Every letter of her signature felt like the snapping of a dry branch in her chest. She realized she no longer held any keys, any roof, or any history in Gray Harbor. She set the pen down and looked at her hands, where a blue ink stain from the pen had marked her skin like a brand of her final liberation. She took the heavy envelope from the man, its bulk filled with $100 bills that smelled of bank vaults and old paper. Back in the truck, she gestured for Toby to come closer. He was huddled against the passenger door, staring out at the rain. Linda counted out the majority of the cash and pressed it into Toby's hands, feeling the fine tremor in his fingers. She pointed to the inner pocket of his jacket, silently demanding he hide it. She watched him zip the money away, his elbow pressed tight against the bulge in his coat. His future now weighed as much as that stack of paper, and Linda felt a portion of her exhaustion finally begin to lift. As she drove back past the house, she saw Mark, his eyes wild, pounding his fists against the locked front door. She watched through the rain-streaked glass as he tried to pry open a window with a piece of scrap wood. Linda calmly reached for her phone and dialed 3 digits, her eyes never leaving the frantic shape of her husband. She saw him turn as the truck slowed, his mouth moving in a silent curse, but she simply gripped the steering wheel tighter. When the first blue flashes of police lights appeared at the end of the block, she leaned her head back against the seat, listening to the rhythmic sweep of the wipers clearing the grime from the glass. Linda and Toby moved quickly, tossing the last of the cardboard boxes into the bed of the truck. The red and blue lights of the patrol car sliced through the fog, turning the wet house into a scene from a nightmare. She saw 2 officers hauling Mark away from the porch, his heels dragging in the gravel as he fought them. Linda pulled a heavy tarp over their belongings and yanked the ropes tight against the rusted hooks of the truck bed. Her fingers were numb from the cold rain, but she didn't stop until the knot was secure. She slammed the tailgate shut with a metallic bang that was swallowed by the distant wail of a foghorn. She stepped inside the house one last time. The kitchen smelled of stagnant air and damp plaster. She walked through the empty rooms, looking at the pale rectangles on the walls where their photos had once hung. Her footsteps echoed in the hollow space, a lonely sound that bounced off the bare floorboards. She pulled her keys from her pocket and set them on the counter, right on top of the crumpled foreclosure notice. She didn't touch anything else, not even the door handle, using her elbow to push her way out. She left behind a house that had become nothing more than a cold, airless box. Linda turned the key in the ignition, and the truck shuddered, belching a cloud of gray smoke into the air. She gripped the wheel as a massive freight train, loaded with scrap metal, began to roll across the tracks ahead. The deafening, prolonged blast of the locomotive's horn shook the truck's windows and vibrated in her very bones. She stared at the endless line of rusted cars, a steel wall cutting her off from the life she had known. As the last car vanished into the mist, she slammed the truck into gear and surged forward, leaving black streaks of rubber on the asphalt. The roar of the train became the soundtrack to her escape. She passed the leaning road sign that marked the city limits, its name nearly invisible under a layer of road salt and grime. In the rearview mirror, she watched the silhouettes of the harbor cranes, looking like prehistoric birds, slowly dissolve into the gray fog. The lights of Gray Harbor became small, flickering dots before they finally vanished behind the curve of the highway. The smell of rotting sea life was replaced by the clean scent of wet pine and the open road. Linda felt the iron tension in her neck finally begin to snap, and the highway ahead, lit by her headlights, looked like a black ribbon leading into the only tomorrow that mattered. The truck merged onto the wide, smooth expanse of the interstate, the hum of the tires on the pavement becoming a steady, hypnotic drone. Linda took one hand off the wheel and rested it on Toby's shoulder. She could feel the fabric of his jacket and the hard edge of the hidden money beneath. Toby flinched for a second but didn't pull away. He leaned into the seat, watching the road signs for other states fly past in the dark. Linda saw the light from passing cars illuminate his face, washing away the shadows of the previous night. She squeezed his shoulder, a silent promise of the miles yet to come.